The holiday season is supposed to be a time of joy, celebration, and new beginnings. But for some, it becomes a moment they'll never forget, for all the wrong reasons. Tonight, I'll share with you chilling New Year's stories that prove the unexpected can happen when the world is distracted by celebration. These are real accounts of fear, suspense, and the unexplainable. Turn off the lights, settle in, and let's dive into the unknown. My name is Paul, and I'll never forget what happened on New Year's Eve a few years ago. My friends and I had this tradition of doing something wild every New Year's Eve. Usually, it was just silly stuff, camping out in odd places, sneaking into rooftops to watch fireworks, or pulling pranks on one another. But that year, we decided to take it up a notch. Someone suggested exploring an old, abandoned factory just outside town. It was supposed to be haunted, of course, but we didn't take those rumors seriously. The place had been shut down for decades, and the stories about it were the usual urban legends: disappearing workers, strange noises, and a fire that no one could explain. It sounded perfect for a night of laughs and scares, so 5 of us, me, Jake, Sarah, Linda, and Tom, piled into a car and headed out around 10 p.m. The factory loomed over us when we arrived, its broken windows staring back like hollow eyes. The main entrance was chained shut, but we found a gap in the fence and slipped through. The air felt colder inside the grounds, and the silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional crunch of gravel under our boots. We made our way inside, using flashlights to navigate the massive, decaying structure. There was graffiti everywhere, some of it funny, some of it unsettling, with phrases like "they never left" and "turn back now" scrawled on the walls. It was eerie, sure, but we were still having fun, laughing and daring each other to go deeper. Around 11:30, we reached the main floor, a vast, empty space with rusted machinery scattered about. That's when things started to feel off. The air grew heavier, and the laughter faded as we noticed something strange: a circle of candles in the center of the room. They were freshly lit. "Who else is here?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. No one answered because, honestly, none of us wanted to consider the possibilities. Tom joked that it was probably just some teenagers pulling a prank, but his voice lacked conviction. We decided to leave, but as we turned back, we heard it, a faint humming sound, like a low, guttural chant. Jake pointed his flashlight toward the far end of the room, and that's when we saw them. 3 figures stood in the shadows, dressed in what looked like robes. Their faces were obscured, but their heads turned toward us in unison as if they had been expecting us all along. "Run," I muttered, and no one needed convincing. We bolted for the exit, but the layout of the factory was a maze. Doors that had been opened before were suddenly locked or blocked. The humming grew louder, echoing off the walls, and I swear I could hear footsteps behind us. When we finally burst out into the open air, gasping and stumbling, we didn't stop running until we were back at the car. As we sped away, Linda turned to look back and let out a gasp. "What?" Jake asked, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "They're watching us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what she saw. We never talked about it after that night. I still don't know who, or what, was in that factory, but every New Year's Eve, when the clock strikes midnight, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures again. Maybe some traditions are better left behind. Second story. My name is Josh, and what happened to me on New Year's Day still gives me chills every time I think about it. After a night of celebrating the new year with my family, I went to bed feeling exhausted but content. The party had been great, lots of laughter, good food, and the kind of joy that only comes when you're surrounded by loved ones. By the time I laid down, I was too tired to even check my phone, and I fell asleep almost instantly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with an urgent need to use the bathroom. Groggily, I got up and made my way down the dimly lit hallway. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock in the living room. As I passed the kitchen on my way back to bed, I heard it, a faint rustling sound. At first, I thought it might be our dog, Max, rummaging around. But then I remembered, Max was staying with my grandparents for the week. I stopped in my tracks, suddenly wide awake. The sound came again, more distinct this time, the shuffle of feet and the soft clinking of glass. Someone was in the kitchen. Heart pounding, I crept closer, trying to keep my steps as quiet as possible. The door to the kitchen was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see the faint glow of the refrigerator light spilling out into the dark. I peeked in, and my stomach dropped. A man was standing there, his back to me, rummaging through the fridge. His clothes were filthy and torn, and his unkempt hair hung down past his shoulders. He muttered to himself as he grabbed leftovers and shoved them into a plastic bag. For a moment, I was frozen, unsure of what to do. Should I yell? Run back to my room and call the police? The thought of confronting him terrified me. What if he was armed? Before I could decide, the man turned slightly, as if sensing my presence. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and wild, and he looked right at me. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice hoarse and shaky. "I'm just hungry." My throat was dry, but I managed to stammer out, You need to leave." He held up his hands, the bag of food dangling from one of them. I'm going," he said, backing toward the door. I stepped aside, keeping my distance as he shuffled past me and out the back door. I locked it behind him, my hands trembling. It wasn't until he was gone that I realized how vulnerable we had been. How had he gotten in? I checked the back door again and noticed that the lock was old and loose. It must have been easy for him to force it open. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. They were shaken but relieved that the man hadn't tried to hurt anyone. We called a locksmith that same day to replace all the locks in the house. I still think about that man sometimes, especially on cold nights when I'm lying in bed. I wonder what drove him to break into our house that night, what kind of life he was living. And though I'm grateful nothing worse happened, I can't shake the memory of his desperate eyes and the sound of his voice. New Year's Day will never feel quite the same for me. Let's go to the third story. My name is Susie, and what happened to me on New Year's Eve during a trip with my friends was the most terrifying experience of my life. Last year, my friends and I decided to spend New Year's Eve in a city far from home. It was supposed to be a celebration of freedom and new beginnings. We booked a hotel, planned out our night, and felt excited about ringing in the new year in a place none of us had ever been before. The evening started perfectly. We dressed up, went out for dinner, and spent hours at a bustling street party, surrounded by fireworks, music, and crowds of people. It was almost midnight when we decided to head back to the hotel, slightly tipsy but in good spirits. As we walked along the quieter streets toward our hotel, I began to feel uneasy. At first, I thought it was just a late hour and the unfamiliar surroundings, but then I noticed two men walking behind us. They were far enough away to not seem immediately threatening, but something about their presence felt off. I whispered to my friends, and we decided to take a detour to see if they were actually following us. We turned onto a side street, pretending to look for a convenience store, and sure enough, they followed. At that point, we knew it wasn't a coincidence. Our pace quickened as we tried to get back to the hotel as fast as possible. The men kept their distance but didn't stop trailing us. By the time we reached the lobby, all of us were panicked. The receptionist was friendly but seemed unsure of what to do when we explained what had happened. We rushed up to our room, locked the door, and called the police. While we waited for them to arrive, we heard someone knocking on the door, 3 loud, deliberate knocks. We froze, not daring to make a sound. The knocking stopped after a few minutes, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. When the police finally showed up, they checked the hotel and the surrounding area but didn't find anyone. They assured us that we were safe for the night, but we decided we couldn't stay there any longer. Early the next morning, we packed our bags and checked out. As we were leaving, one of my friends went to the front desk to settle the bill. That's when she saw him, the man who had been following us the night before. He was wearing a uniform and chatting casually with the receptionist. He worked there. We left immediately, our hearts racing. The realization that someone who was supposed to provide a sense of safety had been the one stalking us was horrifying. That trip changed how I view traveling. I no longer take safety for granted, and I'm always hyper-aware of my surroundings. New Year's Eve is meant to be a time for celebration, but for me, it will always carry the memory of fear and the lesson that you can't trust everyone, even those who seem like they're meant to protect you. Now, the last story. My name is Austin, and what I experienced on New Year's Eve last year still gives me chills every time I think about it. That night started out just like any other New Year's Eve, loud, exciting, and filled with laughter. My friends and I spent the evening downtown, counting down to midnight amidst the crowds, fireworks lighting up the sky, and everyone celebrating the fresh start of a new year. When the celebrations ended, I began walking home alone. It wasn't too far, and the streets were mostly empty by then, except for the occasional group of people still partying in the distance. My neighborhood was quiet, with only the glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the sidewalks. As I approached my house, I noticed something strange across the street, near the edge of my neighbor's yard. At first, I thought it was some kind of decoration, a tall, pale figure standing completely still in the darkness. It was facing my house, and its sheer height caught my attention. It had no features, no colors, no definition, just this ghostly white, almost as if it were drained of life. I stopped in my tracks, confused. Who would put up such a creepy decoration for New Year's? I thought to myself. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to cross the street to get a closer look. As I approached, a sense of unease crept over me. The figure didn't move, but I could feel something off about it. The closer I got, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a decoration. Its shape was too irregular, its stillness too unnatural. When I was just a few feet away, it suddenly moved. Not a casual or human-like movement, but a sharp, jerky lurch as if it had been waiting for me to get closer. That's when I saw its arms reach out toward me. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run as fast as I could. I sprinted across the street and into my house, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding as I locked every door and window, my mind racing with what I had just seen. I peeked out from behind the curtains, but the figure was gone. It had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't sleep that night, and for weeks after, I couldn't shake the image of that pale, faceless figure standing there, waiting. I never saw anything like it again, but I'll never forget how real it felt, the way it moved, the overwhelming fear that took over me. To this day, I have no explanation for what I saw. Whatever it wasn't human, and it certainly wasn't a decoration. That New Year's Eve, I learned that some things are better left unexplored, no matter how curious you might be. As the clock strikes midnight and a new year begins, most of us look forward to fresh starts and better days. But for the people in these stories, their New Year's celebrations took a turn they'll never forget. Whether it's the unexplainable or the terrifyingly real, these experiences remind us that the unknown can find us when we least expect it. Thank you for listening, and stay safe as you ring in the new year, because sometimes, the scariest things happen when we think we're safe.